A pilot refuses to greet a black woman boarding a private jet and is immediately fired when her husband steps in. Sometimes, power doesn't come from shouting or demanding. It comes from silence, patience, and knowing exactly when to act. On a cold, quiet tarmac, one man thought his position as pilot gave him control, but his arrogance blindsided him. When he refused to greet a black woman boarding a private jet, he had no idea who she really was or how her quiet resolve would bring his career to an unexpected and final end. What happened next sent shock waves through the crew and left him facing consequences he never saw coming. A single moment of disrespect became the biggest mistake of his life. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, bathing the tarmac in hues of soft gold and dusky violet. The gentle hum of private jets idling filled the air, punctuated by the occasional clank of metal or the muffled voices of ground crew preparing for takeoff. It was a serene scene, one that typically exuded exclusivity and quiet luxury. A sleek silver jet sat on the runway, its sharp lines glinting in the waning sunlight. The stairs had been lowered in anticipation of the passengers' arrival, and the cabin crew, pristine in their crisp uniforms, stood ready near the entrance. At the base of the steps stood Captain Victor Vance, his posture stiff and self-assured, chin raised just slightly, as if the world owed him acknowledgement. His pale blue eyes scanned the horizon with an edge of impatience. "She's late," Victor muttered under his breath, his lips curling into a faint sneer. Typical. The nearby crew members exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing. Victor's reputation preceded him. Efficient in the cockpit, yes, but intolerable outside it. He'd piloted private jets for years, often boasting that he could spot new money a mile away, his tone always dismissive. It was no secret that his views on who belonged in this exclusive world were outdated at best. In the distance, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the edge of the tarmac. The driver, clad in a dark suit, stepped out to open the rear passenger door. Out emerged Clara Evans. Her presence was quiet yet commanding. She stepped onto the pavement with the graceful poise of someone who knew exactly who she was. Clara was striking, not just because of her polished, tailored Eteria-rich navy coat draping elegantly over her shoulders, but because of the aura she carried, a quiet strength and confidence that didn't need to announce itself. Her assistant, a petite woman named Maya, stepped out after her, juggling Clara's designer suitcase and a leather portfolio. Together, they walked toward the jet, the rhythmic click of Clara's heels on the tarmac sharp against the fading sounds of the airfield. Captain Victor watched them approach, his expression hardening. From where he stood, his judgment began before Clara had even reached the stairs. Her type, he thought bitterly, though he didn't dare say it aloud. As Clara approached, she caught the slight narrowing of his eyes, the way his posture stiffened further, as if bracing for something he already decided he wouldn't like. It was subtle, but Clara noticed it immediately. Years of navigating high-powered boardrooms and elite events had made her fluent in reading body language, especially when it shifted toward dismissal or disdain. Still, Clara said nothing. She offered a poised, professional smile as she neared the stairs. "Good evening," she greeted warmly, her voice smooth and even. Victor didn't respond. He didn't even meet her gaze. Instead, he shifted slightly to the side, looking past her as though she hadn't spoken at all. The cabin crew standing at the top of the stairs looked down in awkward silence, clearly noting the exchange but unsure of how to respond. "Captain Vance," Maya ventured politely, stepping in. "We're ready to board." Victor's head turned toward the assistant, a flicker of disdain crossing his features before he quickly masked it. "Yes," he said curtly, his voice clipped. "The flight is prepped." Without waiting for acknowledgement, he turned sharply and disappeared into the cockpit, his polished shoes echoing on the steps. Clara blinked, a faint crease forming between her brows, but she quickly smoothed her expression. She turned to Maya and murmured softly, "You see it, don't you?" Maya glanced at Clara nervously. "I do. Do you want me to?" Clara shook her head. "No need. He's shown his character. We'll see how far he takes it." Her tone wasn't bitter, nor was it resigned. There was only calm observation, as if she were studying a piece of art she didn't particularly care for. Clara had been through enough in life to know that people like Captain Victor always revealed themselves more fully given time. With a small smile, she climbed the steps, accepting the warm greetings of the cabin crew with her usual grace. Behind her, Maya followed, casting a wary glance back toward the cockpit. Inside the private jet was immaculate, white leather seats, polished wood trim, and soft ambient lighting that glowed like a halo across the cabin. A chilled glass of sparkling water waited at Clara's seat, along with a small vase holding a single white orchid. Clara eased herself into one of the wide, cushioned seats, crossing her legs as she took in the quiet luxury around her. The crew immediately set to ensuring her comfort, their manners polished and respectful, though there was an undeniable tension in the air. They had noticed their captain's behavior too. One of the attendants hesitated before speaking. "Mrs. Evans, we'll be taking off shortly. Please let us know if you need anything at all." "Thank you," Clara replied kindly, giving her a warm smile. For a few moments, there was nothing but the hum of the engines warming outside and the faint shuffling of feet. Clara pulled out her phone, responding to a few quick messages. When the cockpit door opened again, Victor appeared briefly, his gaze flicking to Clara as he made his pre-flight announcement. "Cabin crew, prepare for takeoff," he said flatly, as if he were reading from a script. Not once did he acknowledge Clara directly. From her seat, Clara allowed herself a small sigh, her polished exterior never faltering. It wasn't the first time she'd faced this kind of treatment, and deep down, she knew it wouldn't be the last. But what people like Captain Victor failed to understand was that ignoring her, or worse, underestimating her, never ended the way they thought it would. The jet trembled as the engines roared to life. Outside the window, Clara watched the runway stretch ahead, the world bathed in twilight. She knew the moment was coming when this calm surface would break. For now, though, she waited. She always waited. Justice, after all, was most satisfying when it arrived at just the right time. The hum of the engines grew steady as the private jet began taxiing down the runway. Inside, the cabin was silent except for the soft clink of crystal glasses as the attendants completed their final preparations. Clara sat still, her gaze calm as she stared out the window, the darkening sky swallowing the last remnants of daylight. From the cockpit, Captain Victor Vance tightened his grip on the control yoke, his jaw clenched. His mind lingered on the passenger seated behind him, Clara Evans, and the unease he felt around her presence. He didn't know much about her, nor did he care to. To him, she was just another symbol of a world that, in his mind, was becoming too accessible to the wrong people. "She probably married rich," he muttered under his breath, though no one could hear him. These days, anyone can buy their way into anything. His voice carried the kind of bitterness only someone burdened with their own insecurities could wield. In Victor's eyes, the jet was a sacred space reserved for what he deemed real power, and Clara, poised, elegant, unbothered, seemed to unsettle him simply by existing. The jet lifted smoothly into the air, its ascent like silk through the night sky. Clara felt the familiar pressure press her into the cushioned seat, but she remained serene, one hand resting lightly on the armrest, the other holding a glass of sparkling water. The attendants, now seated for takeoff, cast cautious glances toward the closed cockpit door, their earlier unease lingering like smoke. Maya sat across from Clara, fidgeting with her tablet. She finally broke the silence, her voice soft and uncertain. "Mrs. Evans," Maya began, glancing up, "do you want me to file a report when we land? About the pilot?" Clara took a slow sip of her water, savoring the coolness as it slid down her throat. She lowered the glass, her eyes turning toward Maya with a faint, knowing smile. "Not yet," Clara said simply. "Let's see how this plays out." Maya furrowed her brows, clearly confused. "But well, you know, he's being completely unprofessional. I don't understand why you're letting him get away with it." Clara chuckled softly, a low, musical sound that seemed to lighten the air just a little. "I'm not letting him get away with anything, Maya. Trust me, people like him always overstep eventually. All you have to do is give them enough rope, and they'll hang themselves." The words were calm, not vengeful, yet they carried an edge that silenced further discussion. Clara had learned long ago that patience was her greatest weapon. People underestimated her because she didn't fight every battle that presented itself. But when the moment came, when she chose to act, it was always with precision and impact. Still, Maya couldn't hide her concern. "You shouldn't have to deal with this," she murmured. Clara's smile remained faint, but her eyes softened as she turned back to the window. "I've dealt with far worse, my dear. This is just noise." In the cockpit, Victor glanced at the cabin camera feed, a small monitor showing the passengers seated behind him. He sneered as Clara appeared on the screen. composed, calm, and completely unaware, in his mind, of her place. She thinks she owns the world, he muttered to his co-pilot, a younger man named Simon who sat quietly beside him. Simon shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sir, I don't think. I know exactly what I'm talking about. Victor snapped, cutting him off. I've been flying these jets for years, Simon. You think I don't see what's happening? This job used to mean something. It was for people who earned it. Now, it's all billionaires and trophy wives parading around like they belong here. Simon looked away, clearly disagreeing but too intimidated to speak up. Victor's arrogance filled the cockpit like stale air, suffocating and heavy. What about her husband? Simon ventured cautiously, breaking the silence. Isn't she married to someone important? Victor scoffed. Probably some guy who inherited his daddy's fortune. That's how these people get by. They marry into money, flash it around, and act like they earned a seat on this jet. He shook his head with a condescending laugh, unaware of the irony of his words. What Victor couldn't see, what he refused to see, was the reality of the woman sitting quietly in the cabin. Clara Evans was not just the wife of someone powerful. She was powerful in her own right. The empire she and her husband had built was a testament to their hard work, discipline, and vision. But men like Victor rarely looked beyond their assumptions. Back in the cabin, Clara placed her glass down on the polished table in front of her, the crystal chiming softly against its surface. She turned her attention back to Maya, who had finally stopped fidgeting, her own tablet now idle in her lap. Maya, Clara said softly, her voice breaking the quiet. Do you remember what I told you when you started working with me? Maya looked up, blinking in surprise. Yes. You said to always trust my instincts, but never let anyone else rattle me. Clara's smile widened slightly. Exactly. You can't control how people behave, but you can always control how you respond. That's where real power lies. As Clara's words lingered in the air, the jet continued its steady climb, cutting through the clouds like a knife through silk. Outside, the world fell away into a sea of darkness, the cabin lit only by the soft glow of overhead lights. Unbeknown to Victor, the rope he was so carelessly weaving around himself was tightening with every moment that passed. For now, Clara waited, biding her time as always. Because people like Captain Victor always revealed their true colors, and when they did, they never realized how swiftly the world could turn against them. The private jet soared steadily above the clouds, the world below reduced to an expanse of darkness punctuated by faint glimmers of distant city lights. The cabin, hushed and cocooned in luxury, felt like a world apart. The soft hum of the engines enveloped Clara as she sat quietly in her seat, her gaze fixed on the window, as if the scene beyond offered her some private solace. It was not the first time she had flown like this, wrapped in silence, power, and elegance, but something about this particular journey felt different. It wasn't the flight itself, nor the destination. It was the man in the cockpit, a man whose arrogance festered like an unseen wound, growing uglier by the minute. In the cockpit, Captain Victor Vance sat rigid, his eyes flickering between the instrument panel and the faint glow of the cabin camera feed. On the screen, Clara sat still, composed, unshaken. Her every move seemed deliberate, her calm presence a direct affront to him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Victor had always prided himself on his ability to read people. Composure, he often told junior pilots, is the first sign of someone faking it. And yet, the woman sitting behind him didn't falter, didn't fidget. She didn't do anything that fit into his narrative of people who didn't belong. He shifted uncomfortably, the leather of his pilot seat creaking beneath him. His thoughts spiraled. Who does she think she is, acting like she owns the place? The truth, that Clara Evans did own the place in every sense, was a truth Victor refused to accept. The more composed Clara appeared, the more his temper flared, like embers stoked into a flame. Simon, the young co-pilot, noticed Victor's growing agitation. With tentative caution, he cleared his throat. Captain, is everything okay? You seem distracted. Victor's glare snapped toward him. Eyes on your instruments, Simon. Don't concern yourself with me. But, I said focus. Victor barked, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Simon fell silent, shoulders tensing as he turned back to the instruments. Victor muttered to himself, shaking his head. Kids these days. No backbone. For a moment, silence returned to the cockpit, save for the rhythmic beep of controls and the low hum of the engines. Victor's thoughts festered like poison, clouding his mind as his frustration simmered. Back in the cabin, Maya sat across from Clara, her gaze lingering on her boss with a mix of curiosity and concern. Despite the tension earlier, Clara had fallen into an almost meditative calm. She wasn't scrolling through her phone, answering emails, or busying herself with work. She simply sat there, quiet and still, her gaze fixed on the night sky beyond the window. "Mrs. Evans?" Maya finally ventured, breaking the silence. Clara turned her head slightly, her expression soft but attentive. "Yes, Maya." Maya hesitated, then spoke carefully. "I don't understand how you're so calm after what happened earlier. I mean, that pilot. He's being so openly rude. Doesn't it bother you?" Clara's lips curled into a faint smile, as though she had anticipated the question. "Of course it bothers me," she replied gently. "But people like him don't deserve my energy." "Not yet." Maya frowned. "But why not now?" Clara's gaze drifted to the window again, the faint glow of the moon casting a soft light across her face. Her voice was low, almost contemplative. "Because power is a dance, Maya. Sometimes the best move is to wait until your partner stumbles. Men like him, they can't help themselves. Their pride won't let them stop." Maya tilted her head, still uncertain but willing to trust Clara's wisdom. "You think he's going to mess up even more?" "I know he will," Clara said softly. "They always do." The cabin settled into silence once again as Clara returned to her thoughts. But in the cockpit, Victor's mind churned with growing resentment. The stillness of the cabin camera feed irritated him more than he cared to admit. Simon stole a glance at him and spoke up cautiously. "Sir, we're at cruising altitude. The systems are stable. I can monitor if you'd like to take a quick break." Victor's head snapped toward him, his face twisted into something between amusement and contempt. "A break? You think I need a break, Simon?" Simon tensed. "I just meant, just keep your mouth shut and do your job," Victor snapped. Simon sighed softly and returned his focus to the instruments. Though he couldn't help but glance at the camera feed, his brows furrowing as he watched Clara sit there, calm, untouched by the storm Victor was brewing. Victor couldn't take it anymore. He pressed the cabin intercom button, his voice flat and cold as it rang out through the speakers. "Mrs. Evans," Victor's voice echoed through the cabin. "If you require anything during the flight, feel free to ask the attendants. Otherwise, I'll keep the seat belt sign on for the remainder of the journey for your safety." The words were laced with something unmistakable, condescension. Maya's mouth dropped slightly in disbelief. "Did he just—" Clara raised one hand, stopping her assistant mid-sentence. She reached for her glass of water, took a slow sip, and set it down deliberately. Her expression didn't flicker. Maya, on the other hand, couldn't contain her anger. "I can't believe this. He's trying to make it seem like we're being difficult passengers." Clara's eyes remained on the intercom speaker, her lips pressing into a small, unreadable smile. "He's setting his own trap," she murmured, almost to herself. In the cockpit, Simon couldn't hide his discomfort. "Captain, was that really necessary?" She wasn't asking for anything. Victor shot him a withering look. "Watch your tone, Simon. You're not here to question me." Simon opened his mouth to argue, but something in Victor's sharp gaze made him pause. Instead, he slumped slightly in his seat, eyes turning back to the glowing instruments. Yet a pit of unease settled deep in his gut. He couldn't shake the feeling that Victor was pushing too far. Back in the cabin, Clara closed her eyes briefly, her face serene as if she were simply resting. But inside, her thoughts were sharp, focused, and deliberate. "He's unraveling," she thought. Patience was always her greatest strength. People like Victor, driven by their arrogance and insecurity, always revealed themselves in the end. Clara knew this. She had seen it time and again. And when they did, when they finally showed the world who they truly were, it would never be her hand that struck the final blow. They would fall all on their own. As the jet glided smoothly through the night sky, Clara folded her hands in her lap, waiting, watching. Justice, she had learned, was rarely loud or immediate. It was quiet, unrelenting, and it always arrived when it was least expected. The private jet sailed through the night sky, silent but for the low hum of the engines and the occasional rustle of the cabin crew tending to small details. Outside, the world was cloaked in an endless expanse of darkness, the stars blinking faintly as though bearing witness to something unraveling. Inside, the air felt heavier, though neither Clara nor Maya said a word about it. Clara sat motionless, her fingers tracing the smooth edge of her glass absent-mindedly. To an outsider, She appeared completely at ease, like a queen on her throne. But beneath the surface of her calm exterior, she could sense something shifting, a tension growing tighter like a rubber band stretched too far. It wouldn't be long now. In the cockpit, Captain Victor Vance tightened his grip on the control yoke, his knuckles white as his frustration simmered closer to boiling. The woman behind him, Clara Evans, was all he could think about, though he couldn't quite explain why. There she was, seated in luxury on a jet he piloted, surrounded by comfort and service as if she were royalty. And yet, she hadn't even done anything. She hadn't challenged him, raised her voice, or given him cause for the growing resentment twisting in his gut. And that, he realized bitterly, was the problem. Clara's calm was like a mirror held up to his face, reflecting back his insecurities with every composed breath she took. Her refusal to react, to flinch at his petty behavior, gnawed at him like a splinter he couldn't remove. In Victor's mind, she was mocking him without ever saying a word. His jaw ticked as he leaned closer to the cabin camera feed. The screen glowed faintly, showing Clara seated with the same unshakable stillness, her assistant Maya casting nervous glances toward the cockpit door. The sight of them, their calm, their quiet, only fanned the flames of Victor's irritation. They think they're better than me, he muttered to himself, voice low and venomous. Simon, the co-pilot, shifted uneasily in his seat. Sir, Victor snapped his head around, his expression sharp. Nothing. Mind your job. Simon pressed his lips together and turned back to the instruments. He didn't need to be told twice, but deep down, he couldn't shake the growing unease clawing at him. Victor wasn't just agitated. He was obsessed. It wasn't right. Back in the cabin, Clara tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. The faint crackle of the intercom, the hushed sounds of movement from the cockpit, the subtle shift of air. It all told her a story. People often believed that power was about domination, about being the loudest voice in the room. But Clara knew better. True power was silent, composed. It was the ability to hold your ground while others flailed and fought against themselves. And right now, Victor Vance was fighting a losing battle. Maya's voice broke through Clara's thoughts, soft but tinged with frustration. Mrs. Evans, I don't get it. Why is he acting this way? It's like he's trying to provoke you. Clara's gaze remained fixed on the dark sky beyond the window. Because I haven't given him what he wants. Maya frowned. What do you mean? Clara turned to face her assistant, her expression steady but thoughtful. Some people thrive on reactions, Maya. It's their way of feeling in control, of proving something to themselves. If I gave him my anger, my frustration, or even my acknowledgement of his behavior, I'd be giving him exactly what he's looking for. So you're not going to do anything? Maya asked incredulous. Oh, I will, Clara said softly, a faint smile playing at the corner of her lips. But not yet. Not until he's gone too far. Maya stared at her boss for a long moment, then finally shook her head in disbelief. You're a lot more patient than I'd ever be. Clara chuckled softly, her voice low and melodic. Patience, my dear, is what separates those who win from those who lose. The words lingered in the air, quiet but powerful. In the cockpit, Victor's frustration reached its peak. He could feel his control slipping, and that infuriated him more than anything. Who was this woman to make him feel like this? Who was she to sit there so smug, so calm, as if she were untouchable? He wouldn't let her win. Simon, Victor said suddenly, his voice sharp. Simon jumped slightly. Yes, sir. Switch the cabin speakers back to my channel, Victor ordered. Simon hesitated. Sir, the flight is stable. There's no need for. I said switch it. Victor barked, his voice cold and unrelenting. Simon swallowed hard, his hands hovering over the controls. Reluctantly, he complied. With a faint click, Victor's voice would now carry through the cabin speakers. Victor took a breath, his lips curling into a smug smile. Let's see how calm she is now, he muttered under his breath, gripping the intercom switch. He leaned into the mic. His voice rang out through the cabin, falsely polite but dripping with condescension. Ladies and gentlemen, Victor began, though the only passengers were Clara and Maya. This is your captain speaking. We'd like to remind all passengers to remain seated for the duration of the flight, as unexpected turbulence can be unsettling. For everyone's safety, we appreciate your cooperation and understanding. The message was innocent on the surface, but Clara understood the intention. Victor was trying to unnerve her, to remind her that he was in control of the jet, the flight, the sky. Maya's mouth fell open as the message ended. Did he seriously just? Clara exhaled slowly, placing her hands on the armrest, as if grounding herself. She smiled faintly, her eyes narrowing slightly in thought. He's close, she murmured softly. Maya blinked. Close to what? To showing his hand, Clara replied, her tone quiet but razor sharp. He thinks this is a game. He doesn't realize he's already lost. Back in the cockpit, Victor sat back in his seat, smug satisfaction radiating off him like heat. That should remind her who's in charge, he said, more to himself than to Simon. Simon's hands twitched on the controls, his voice tight. Captain, I really don't think that announcement was necessary. It's unprofessional and… Enough, Simon. Victor snapped, his voice harsh. I don't need a lecture from you. Simon fell silent again, but a pit of unease sat heavily in his chest. Something was going to go wrong. He could feel it. Victor's behavior was spiraling, and there would be consequences. Victor, however, didn't see it that way. He leaned back in his seat, his arrogance cocooning him like a shield. He had made his point, or so he thought. In the cabin, Clara leaned back into her seat, her posture relaxed, but her eyes held a spark of sharp clarity. Victor had overstepped. His ego had pushed him too far. He's done, Clara said softly, more to herself than to Maya. Maya stared at her, wide-eyed. What do you mean? Clara's smile returned, cool and unwavering. You'll see soon enough. The private jet cut through the clouds like a blade, silent and swift. For now, the cabin remained a haven of calm, but the storm, quiet and patient, was gathering strength. And when it hit, Victor Vance wouldn't know what had struck him. The private jet glided through the night sky like a silent predator, cloaked in darkness and secrecy. Yet within its polished confines, tension rippled through the air like invisible threads, ready to snap. In the cockpit, Captain Victor Vance sat rigid, his hands locked on the control yoke even though the autopilot held steady. The soft glow of the instrument panel flickered against his face, the hum of the engines filling the silence between him and his co-pilot, Simon. Victor's smug satisfaction lingered like stale smoke after his last petty announcement. To him, the message was a final assertion of his control, his position as the one in charge. But deep down, he felt it, an unease gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. She's too calm, he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. Simon looked over cautiously, his voice careful. Sir? What did you say? Victor's eyes flicked toward him, sharp and unrelenting. Nothing. Just check the altitude again. Simon turned back to his instruments, his movements stiff and precise. The unease he felt had only grown since takeoff. Victor was unraveling, and there was no mistaking it. His fixation on the passenger, Mrs. Evans, had crossed a line. Simon had heard stories about pilots like Victor, men whose insecurities festered over years of unchecked arrogance. They thought they were invincible in the cockpit, their titles shielding them from accountability. But watching Victor now, Simon knew the shield was cracking, and when it broke, it would shatter completely. In the cabin, Clara sat with her usual unshakable poise, her gaze fixed out the window. The moonlight danced across the clouds below, casting pale, silvery shadows that seemed to stretch forever. Beside her, Maya sat with her arms crossed, the tension in her small frame clear as she fidgeted with the hem of her skirt. Her frustration was visible, but Clara's serenity, her ability to stay composed, only deepened Maya's confusion. I still don't get it, Maya murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. How can you just sit there? He's practically mocking you. Clara turned her head, her expression soft but deliberate. Her voice carried no anger, only quiet certainty. Because his downfall is already in motion, Maya. He just doesn't know it yet. Maya blinked, her brow furrowing. What do you mean? Clara offered a small, enigmatic smile. People like him always reveal themselves. The more you let them act unchecked, the more they show the world who they really are. He's on borrowed time. Maya exhaled sharply, her frustration barely held back. I still don't see why we have to wait for it to happen. Clara reached for her glass of sparkling water, her fingers brushing the crystal stem with practiced grace. She lifted it to her lips, taking a slow sip before lowering it carefully. Because patience, my dear, is what makes the lesson stick. The words hung in the air, cool and unshakable, as if they were etched in stone. Back in the cockpit, Victor's thoughts churned like storm clouds, dark and consuming. The sound of Clara's name, Mrs. Evans, had begun to grate on him. Every time Simon or the cabin crew mentioned it, It wasn't just her presence that unsettled him, it was her silence. In his mind, Clara should have reacted by now. She should have complained, protested, or demanded answers for his disrespect. Instead, she sat there in complete calm, unbothered by his petty attempts to rattle her. And that infuriated him. Victor's fingers tightened around the yoke as he leaned back in his seat. The cabin camera feed glowed on the screen in front of him, showing Clara seated with quiet grace, her hands folded lightly in her lap. "What's her game?" Victor muttered, his voice barely audible. Hearing him, Simon turned slightly. "Captain, I really think you should calm down. You're letting this get to you." Victor shot him a glare, his voice harsh and clipped. "I'm fine, Simon. Focus on the damn instruments." Simon pressed his lips into a thin line, but he didn't argue. The tension in the cockpit felt suffocating, and Victor's spiraling behavior was like a storm cloud growing heavier by the minute. Then, as if compelled by his own frustration, Victor made a decision. "I'm going to step back there," he said suddenly, pushing himself out of his seat. Simon's head whipped around, his eyes wide. "Sir, you can't." "I can and I will." Victor snapped, his tone final. "You think I'm going to let some passenger sit there and act like she owns this jet?" Simon tried again, his voice pleading. "Captain, this isn't a good idea. If something happens—" "Nothing's going to happen," Victor growled, straightening his uniform jacket. "Watch the controls." Before Simon could protest further, Victor unlocked the cockpit door and stepped into the cabin. The quiet hum of the engines filled the cabin as Victor's footsteps echoed down the narrow aisle. Clara noticed him immediately, though she didn't turn her head. She remained exactly as she was, calm, poised, and waiting. Maya, on the other hand, stiffened as she caught sight of the captain striding toward them, his expression dark and hard. "Oh no," she murmured under her breath. Victor stopped a few feet away from Clara's seat, his presence casting a shadow over the soft glow of the cabin. For a long moment, he said nothing, standing there as though waiting for Clara to acknowledge him. But Clara didn't. She took her time, lifting her gaze to meet his with a quiet intensity that seemed to strip away his bravado layer by layer. There was no anger in her eyes, no fear, only an unshakable calm that unnerved him far more than shouting ever could. "Is there something I can help you with, Captain?" Clara asked softly, her voice measured and even. Victor bristled at her tone. "I thought I'd check in, to see if everything was satisfactory," he said, though the falseness of his words was impossible to miss. Clara's gaze didn't waver. "Everything is quite satisfactory, thank you." Her calmness was like a knife. Victor could feel it cutting into him, exposing the thin veneer of his control. He opened his mouth to speak again, but Clara's next words stopped him cold. "Unless, of course, there's something you need to say, Captain Vance." Her voice was light, almost curious, but the weight of her words hit like a hammer. Without waiting for a response, he turned on his heel and strode back toward the cockpit, his footsteps harder and louder than before. As the cockpit door clicked shut behind him, Maya let out a shaky breath. "What was that?" Clara smiled faintly, turning her gaze back toward the window. "The storm breaking." Maya blinked, clearly confused, but he didn't even say anything. "That's the point," Clara murmured softly. He showed his weakness without even realizing it. Outside, the clouds parted to reveal the faint glow of city lights below. The end of the journey was near, but Clara knew the real ending, the reckoning, was just beginning. Captain Victor Vance had finally crossed a line, and what came next would change everything. The cabin fell silent after Victor Vance retreated to the cockpit, but the tension lingered like the aftermath of a lightning strike. It wasn't loud or explosivino shouting. No scenes, but the weight of it was palpable, hanging in the air like an invisible thread stretched to its breaking point. Clara's gaze remained on the window, the faint glow of city lights below flickering through the clouds. Her reflection stared back at her, a woman calm and poised, but with eyes that carried an unspoken sharpness, the kind of sharpness one earned only through years of quiet battles and victories no one else saw. Beside her, Maya sat frozen, still trying to process what had just happened. She let out a shallow breath, shaking her head as if the motion could dispel her disbelief. "What was that?" Maya finally whispered, her voice hushed as though she might wake a sleeping beast. Clara didn't immediately answer. Instead, she reached for her glass of sparkling water, lifting it with the same deliberate care she always showed. The glass shimmered faintly in her hand as she took a sip and set it down with precision. "That," Clara said softly, Was a man teetering on the edge of his own destruction? Maya blinked, her brow furrowed. But he didn't do anything. Well, nothing more than usual. Simon, the co-pilot, flinched at the sudden outburst. Captain? What's going on? Victor shot him a glare, his voice sharp and biting. Don't ask questions you don't need answers to. Simon stared at him for a moment before looking away, his hands steadying themselves on the control panel. The air in the cockpit felt heavy, suffocating even, as if Victor's fury was seeping into every corner of the small space. Victor leaned forward, rubbing a hand over his face as he muttered to himself. Thinks she's untouchable, doesn't she? Sitting there, looking down her nose at me like I don't exist. Simon risked a glance at the captain, his unease growing. Sir, I really don't think she's doing anything. She's just sitting there. Victor's head snapped up, his glare cutting through Simon like a blade. That's the problem. Don't you get it? It's people like her. They walk into spaces they don't belong, act like they own it, and no one says a word. Simon hesitated, his voice careful. With all due respect, Captain, this isn't about her. You're letting it get personal. Victor's fist slammed against the armrest of his seat. It is personal. This is my plane. I'm the one in control here. Not her. Not her damn money. And certainly not her attitude. Simon sat back, stunned into silence. He had never seen Victor like this before. The man was unraveling, his usual arrogance giving way to something darker, something dangerous. Captain, Simon said quietly, we're 45 minutes from landing. Why don't we just? I know exactly what I'm doing. Victor snapped, cutting him off. He didn't look at Simon as he turned his attention back to the controls, his movements jerky and too forceful. You focus on your job, and I'll focus on mine. Simon swallowed hard, his gut telling him something was very, very wrong. The flight had been smooth, uneventful on the surface, but Clara knew the storm was building. Victor's ego had brought him this far, and it would be his ego that pulled him over the edge. Maya, sensing the shift, leaned closer. Mrs. Evans, do you think he's okay? He looked, I don't know, unhinged. Clara's expression remained calm, though her voice carried a note of quiet resolve. He's losing control, Maya. And when men like him lose control, they make mistakes. Maya frowned, her voice dropping lower. But we're still in the air. What if he does something reckless? Clara's gaze softened slightly as she looked at her assistant. That's why we always prepare for every possibility. Trust me. Maya wanted to press for more, wanted to ask what Clara meant, but something in Clara's tone silenced her. There was a certainty there, a quiet strength that reassured her even as the unease lingered. Victor's hands shook as he stared at the instruments in front of him. He didn't notice the way Simon was watching him, nor did he care. All he could think about was Clara Evans, sitting there with that infuriating calm, that unshakable confidence. It made him feel small, insignificant, and Victor Vance had spent his whole life fighting against that feeling. I'll show her, he muttered to himself, his voice low and venomous. I'll show her who's really in charge. His hand moved to the intercom switch again, his knuckles white as he gripped it tightly. He didn't know exactly what he wanted to say, but the need to exert power, to make Clara see him, was overwhelming. Simon noticed the movement and sat up straight, his voice sharp with concern. Captain, what are you doing? Victor didn't answer. His finger hovered over the switch as his breathing quickened. Captain, Simon tried again, his voice louder this time. Stop. You're crossing a line. The words cut through Victor like a whip, and for a moment, he froze. Simon's words echoed in his mind, sharp and undeniable. You're crossing a line. He blinked, the anger wavering as reality clawed at the edges of his thoughts. His hands trembled, and then a soft chime echoed through the cockpit. Victor flinched at the sound, his eyes snapping to the control panel. Simon leaned closer, confusion and concern flashing across his face. What was that? Ethan asked. Victor's heart sank as he read the message blinking on the screen, a single, urgent notification from the jet's internal communication system. Incoming message from owner's office. Priority level, immediate. Victor's face paled. Simon looked at him, his voice low and cautious. What does it say, sir? Victor couldn't answer. His mouth went dry as he stared at the screen, the flashing text like a countdown to his demise. The message was from Robert Evans, Clara's husband, and in that moment, Victor knew his time was up. The glow of the cockpit's instrument panel flickered faintly against Victor Vance's pale, sweat-slicked face. The message on the screen, incoming message from owner's office. Priority level, immediate. seemed to burn into his retinas, as if each word carried the weight of his unraveling career. His hands trembled against the control yoke as his mind raced, searching for answers, for a way to regain control. Victor had spent years perched on the brittle ledge of his pride, believing himself untouchable. Now, in the dim light of the cockpit, reality had finally caught up to him. The name Robert Evans glared at him like a death sentence. Simon, the young co-pilot, leaned closer, his brow furrowed. "Sir? What's going on? What does the message say?" Victor didn't answer. His lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. It was as if his body had stopped working, paralyzed by the weight of his own arrogance finally collapsing around him. "Captain," Simon pressed again, his voice tinged with urgency. With a jerk, Victor slapped a hand over the intercom button, silencing any further questions. "Focus on the controls, Simon," he growled, though his voice wavered, betraying his fear. Simon stared at him in disbelief. "Captain, I don't understand. This is from the—" "I said focus," Victor snapped, his voice sharp and frantic. But the damage was done. Victor's mask of composure had cracked wide open, and Simon saw it for what it was: desperation. In the cabin, the hum of the engines was the only sound as Clara sat, her face serene as ever. Her eyes were still fixed on the vast night sky beyond the window. As if on cue, the cabin intercom crackled to life, the static sharp against the heavy quiet. Clara tilted her head slightly, one brow arching as she waited for Victor to speak. But no voice came, only silence. Maya looked toward the cockpit door, her face taut with confusion. "Is something wrong? Why isn't he saying anything?" Clara smiled faintly, her voice a murmur. "Because he doesn't know what to say. The message has reached him." Victor's heart thundered in his chest as he stared at the cockpit screen. He knew what the message meant. There was no hiding from it. Robert Evans wasn't the kind of man to let things slide, not when his company's standards were at stake. Victor had crossed the line, and now the consequences were chasing him down like a storm he couldn't escape. He fumbled at the controls, trying to regain a shred of focus. His mind raced. Maybe I can smooth this over. Maybe it's just a warning. Maybe. But even as the excuses piled up in his mind, Victor knew the truth. Men like Robert Evans didn't send immediate messages without cause. He glanced at the screen one last time. A new line of text appeared. "Expect direct communication upon landing. Prepare for reassignment review." Victor's face went white. Reassignment. It was corporate language, cold and clinical, but he knew exactly what it meant: termination. His career was finished. Simon noticed Victor's shaking hands. "Captain, you're not okay. Let me handle." "Shut up," Victor hissed, his voice cracking as his control slipped further. "I don't need your help." The younger man leaned back, stunned into silence, his eyes wide as he watched his captain, once a figure of confidence, crumble in front of him. The intercom crackled again, this time sharper, as Victor attempted to steady his breathing. His voice finally filtered through, though it was uneven and strained. "Mrs. Evans," he began, his usual arrogance reduced to a shaky attempt at control. "We will be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelt is fastened." The words fell flat, hollow. It was a small, pitiful attempt to maintain authority, and Clara recognized it for what it was: a man grasping at the last threads of his crumbling pride. From her seat, Clara smiled, a calm, measured smile that no one else could see. She leaned back, resting her hands lightly on the armrests as though settling into her throne. "Very well, Captain," she replied smoothly, her voice carrying a weight Victor couldn't match. Maya blinked, looking at Clara in awe. "You're so calm. I'd be losing it right now." Clara turned her head slightly, the smile still present. "Why lose your composure when you've already won?" Victor's breathing grew faster, louder. "Smooth landing. I'll land this perfectly. Maybe they'll reconsider. Maybe." Simon, unable to stay silent, murmured under his breath, "Captain, just focus on the job." But Victor wasn't listening. His thoughts circled one thing, one person: Clara Evans. The woman who had said nothing, done nothing, yet still dismantled him piece by piece without ever lifting a finger. Inside the cabin, Clara unfastened her seat belt with deliberate care, her movements as graceful as ever. Maya exhaled with relief. "We're here." Clara smiled faintly, but said nothing. She knew the real moment was yet to come. At the cockpit, Victor sat frozen, staring straight ahead as if he couldn't bear to move. His headset buzzed faintly with a message from the tower. "Welcome to New York. Mr. Evans' staff is en route to the plane." Prepare for debrief. Victor's stomach dropped. Outside, sleek black SUVs pulled up to the jet, their headlights sharp and unwavering. Men in suits stepped out, their movements deliberate as they approached the stairs. Victor watched through the cockpit window, his breathing shallow as the reality of what awaited him hit like a fist to the gut. "Captain," Simon said quietly. Tyler didn't answer, because in that moment, he knew the truth. He had finally met the end of the line. The hum of the engines had stilled, leaving the private jet eerily silent. Outside, the rhythmic thud of footsteps on the tarmac echoed faintly into the cabin as black SUVs lined up neatly in formation. The soft glow of the cabin lights illuminated Clara Evans' face, composed and elegant, as she sat motionless, watching events unfold with a quiet, discerning eye. Beside her, Maya gripped her tablet tightly, her gaze darting to the windows. Through the glass, she could see sharply dressed men exiting the vehicles, executives, assistants, and security detail. It was clear they weren't here for pleasantries. "Are those Robert's people?" Maya whispered, the unease evident in her voice. Clara gave the smallest nod, her expression serene. "Yes." Maya swallowed, stealing another glance toward the cockpit door. "He's going to lose it. You know that, right?" Clara's lips curled into a faint smile. "He already has." In the cockpit, Victor Vance sat frozen in his seat, his mind a blur of dread and disbelief. The headlights of the approaching SUVs lit up the darkened tarmac outside, the beams cutting through the faint mist hanging in the night air. Each step taken by the men in suits felt like a drum beat growing louder in his head. "Captain, they're here," Simon said quietly from his seat, his tone low and cautious. Victor didn't respond. His face was pale, his hands still locked on the yoke even though the engines had been shut down. It was as if letting go of the controls would finalize what he already knew. His career was over. "They're going to want to talk to you," Simon pressed gently. "You need to. Don't tell me what I need to do." Victor barked, his voice cracking as he turned sharply towards Simon. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his breathing erratic. "You think I don't know what this is about? That woman. She planned this. She's been baiting me from the moment she stepped on this plane." Simon frowned, disbelief flashing across his face. "Sir, you did this to yourself. She didn't say a word to you, and you." "Shut up." Victor spat, his hand slamming down on the armrest. "She's just some rich." He stopped himself, the word hanging unspoken, venom curdling on his tongue. His head dropped, eyes flicking to the ground as he exhaled sharply. The sharp knock on the cockpit door made both men jump. Simon turned toward the door as though it might burst open. "Sir, they're here." Victor didn't move. For a long moment, the two men sat in silence, the knock sounding again, louder this time, more insistent. Finally, Victor stood. The movements were stiff, as if his body resisted every step. He straightened his disheveled jacket and smoothed a hand through his damp hair, forcing himself to breathe. "They're not going to fire me," he muttered under his breath, almost as if trying to convince himself. "I've been here too long. They need me." Simon didn't argue. He simply watched as Victor unlocked the cockpit door and pushed it open. When Victor stepped into the cabin, Clara was already standing, her posture perfectly poised, as if the entire ordeal had been nothing but a minor inconvenience. Her gaze swept over him as he approached, his movements faltering slightly under her quiet scrutiny. "Mrs. Evans," Victor said, forcing a tight smile that looked more like a grimace. "We've landed safely. I trust everything was to your satisfaction." Clara's brow arched slightly at the attempt at civility, her expression remaining calm and unbothered. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the cabin door, where shadows flickered against the frosted glass as Robert Evans' team approached. "I'll let my husband decide," Clara said softly. The words, simple and measured, hit Victor like a punch to the gut. Any fleeting hope he'd had shattered into pieces. The cabin door opened, and in stepped Robert Evans. Robert Evans was a man whose presence could silence a room before he spoke. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, he moved with the confidence of someone who never had to raise his voice to command respect. The men who followed him, security, assistants, and senior executives, waited silently, their expressions unreadable but sharp. "Clara," Robert said first, his voice warm as he strode toward his wife. He kissed her cheek gently before stepping back, his dark gaze flickering toward Victor. Victor's throat went dry. Robert looked at him with a kind of quiet intensity that made Victor feel like he was being dissected on the spot. He didn't need to raise his voice. The power was in his silence, in the way his gaze held Victor in place. "Captain Vance," Robert said at last, his tone calm but deliberate, "would you care to explain your behavior on this flight?" Victor blinked, his mouth opening and closing uselessly for a moment. "Sir, I don't know what you've been told, but there's been a misunderstanding." Robert's brow lifted slightly. "A misunderstanding?" "Yes," Victor said quickly, a flicker of desperation in his voice. "There's nothing to explain. The flight was smooth, and there were no complaints. I've done nothing wrong." Clara's soft voice cut through the room like a razor. "Nothing wrong." Victor turned sharply toward her, his expression twisting as he fought to hold his crumbling composure. "Mrs. Evans, with all due respect." "No," Robert interjected coldly, his gaze narrowing. "You will not address my wife." Victor froze, the words hitting him like a slap. Robert took a step closer, his voice calm but unrelenting. "My team has already received a full report, Captain. Witness statements from the crew, cabin audio records. Your behavior on this flight was unprofessional, unacceptable, and frankly, embarrassing." Victor's face turned crimson as his head shook in disbelief. You can't. You're finished," Robert said, his tone final. "You will no longer fly for this company or any subsidiary under my name. I suggest you pack your things and leave this aircraft immediately. My team will ensure you are escorted from the premises." The silence in the cabin was absolute. Victor stared at Robert, then at Clara, as though searching for some last chance to plead his case. But there was nothing. Clara stood calm and still, her gaze holding him like a mirror to his own shame. For a moment, Victor's chest heaved as if he might shout or protest, but the words never came. He looked at the faces around him. Maya, Robert's team, Simon still lingering at the cockpit door, and realized there was no one left to defend him. He had done this to himself. Victor moved toward the cabin door, his steps heavy and slow, as though his body resisted every motion. Two members of Robert's team flanked him without a word, guiding him down the steps and onto the tarmac where the black SUVs waited. From the window, Maya watched as Victor disappeared into the dark. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "It's over." Clara picked up her coat from her seat, draping it elegantly over her arm. "It's been over since the beginning." Robert turned to his wife with a small smile, his expression softening. "Shall we go?" Clara nodded, slipping her hand gently into his offered arm. Together, they exited the jet, leaving the memory of Victor Vance and his downfall far behind. And just like that, the man who thought he held all the power learned the hardest lesson of his life. Never underestimate the quiet ones, because their silence often holds the loudest consequences.